Hello everyone. My name is Brendan Goodyjohn, and today I'm going to be taking a little bit of time to talk about the psychology of power, control, and wealth, and how these different things can affect our mental health. So during the Victorian era, it was not uncommon to see men throwing their wives in these type of madhouses. Typically, they had more money, and they threw their wives in here for the simple reasons of willfulness, disobedience, or just plain melancholy. Now, this isn't to say that men didn't have the same type of hardships, but theirs were more so focused on the dismissiveness of emotions, or just the inability to be vulnerable with themselves or with others. So through the satirical elements, as well as the displacement and tension created through financial status, Charles Dickens, with his novel Little Dorrit, um, exemplifies the dangers of uh, marginalization that threaten the mental illness and health disorders, which shows the power of status, self-awareness, and inequality within communities. In a climate of political dismissiveness towards the mental health industry, it is more crucial than ever to pay attention to what our developing society looks like from the inside out, and learn from the ignorance of previous times. So, three major points that I want to talk about with you guys today. The environments associated with mental health misconceptions, addressing historical and cultural principles, how Little Dorrit itself displayed these type of elements that undermine the importance of wealth and mental well-being, and then the navigation of the evolution psychology has taken, and how it continues to make these different types of breakthroughs, and how we as Jesuits can go towards being diligent with our social standings. So understanding how humans dealt with differences through misconceptions about mental illness allows the complex nature of social and financial pressures to present themselves. So up until the 1800s, the end of the 1800s, it was assumed that the mind and body were two separate entities, which in turn encouraged the continued study of phrenology, or the study of the human skull, and how that affected the person, or their interests in satisfiable traits. And so this created an ideology of satisfiable traits for women to tend to a man's needs and interests, or that's kind of what the idea was going towards, and that's kind of what the people were trying to study and try to push towards the culture. Masculinity nearly always triumphs with this, compared to the household necessities and the refined roles in a relationship. These became symbolic of less synergetic, more parasitical type of connections, as if the societal hierarchy, wanted to convince the public of the inferiority women brought towards the partnership. But what's even more bothersome is the approach that the Victorian era combated female suicide, and that straying from the behavioral and cultural norms of femininity, that's kind of how they approached what was the leading cause, was that if you went away from how you're supposed to act as a woman, that's what was leading you towards, oh, well, she's just suicidal because of this, that, and the other thing, based on who she is. However, this is not to say that men did not share in the compressing nature of stereotypical identity constructs, causing similar mental hardships during this time period. The importance of the Industrial Revolution during this time should not go unnoticed, as the nature of the job created division of labor by sex, division of labor and sex, and heavy factory work, mining, and construction became distinctively male environments. Emotionally speaking, there are several factors regarding mental health that say that there are benefits to sharing our emotions, such as building closer connections in relationships, relieving tension caused by everyday stressors, as well as the trauma of major life difficulties. By filling the masculine provider role, established cultural standards, there was much less room for men who were mentally unstable, who didn't express these type of qualities of being like dominant and strong. There wasn't a lot of room for them anymore. If they were nervously unstable, they simply were disregarded in a sense. Now, throughout Little Dorrit, moving the subject, although very obscure, there are several consequences that come from the lack of care or acknowledgement given to the displaced or marginalized community. The Dorrit family is the most prevalent of these, um, pointing to the circumstances that can lead to juxtaposition and problematic psychological interference. So William Dorrit displays a very blunt sense of cognitive dissonance when he crowns himself the champion of the Marshalsea of the debtor's prison. The striking realism of being stuck in a prison, unable to work for the money that you originally owe, um, it leans towards a daunting reality for most people, and his lack of interest for his own type of situation. Not to mention what he was putting his family through. This depicts that he was unable to come to terms with his sense of self, therefore adjusting the situation to favor the outcome more than a logical person should. So he became like infatuated with the idea of not having any money, basically, and being just a champion of people who were displaced, who weren't in the place they would want to be. This point is very well articulated through both Mr. Dorrit's less substantiated plot-driven children, Tip and Fanny. Not only has the situation become surreal for the father, but also the displaced members of the family that were not humbled by their lack of affluency. Their antagonism of Amy Dorrit, shows that the brother and sister, like their father, were dealing with the social incongruency of living an epitomized lifestyle and then losing it all to the circumstances out of their control. So last but not least, there is the question of how Amy falls into this conundrum. Unimpressed with financial status, she really just didn't really seem to care about where she was in this type of situation, when she was poor, when she was rich. We see that social status, or practically any other ordinary mark of power control, it's arguably that she may be suffering of multiple personality disorders due to her obsessive desire to control her family's situation, her low self-esteem, and the role she takes on guarding her father from the reality of what his life is truly like for the rest of the family, not trapped in the Marshalsea. Furthermore, analyzing Arthur Clennam's character development through the novel in the same lighting may indicate that he also suffers from several variations of cognitive dissonance. So, by hardly ever asserting himself in the lives of the many people that were displayed in the novel, such as the Meagles, the Dorrits, the Gowans, during the unraveling tale of bureaucracy and government policy, his dissociation becomes somewhat unsettling. After losing his father, regardless of the connection the two had, which isn't necessarily addressed a lot in the novel, it makes the rest of the surface level relationships he creates with nearly everyone to be very strange. We would imagine that after having such a loss, he would want to make better relationships with the people that he had, instead of just, hey, how you doing, like very casual type of relationships. So this may seem somewhat fractional, however, piecing together timeline, occupation, social awareness, and self-esteem. The thought of another main protagonist suffering from some form of mental illness does not seem nearly as far-fetched. He came from a very convoluted parental situation. It was very ineffectual to anyone that he came across. He couldn't get anything done on his own. And the masculine qualities of power and control established earlier, it all kind of ties in together that maybe he was suffering a lot from the situation he was placed in.
Going forward with today's society, two major components are identifying the distinctions or similarities of the evolving world and how we, as a Jesuit culture at Creighton University, can come together to make a difference in our own community. So although the fields of psychology and sociology have progressed dramatically since the end of the Victorian era to present day, there is still a considerable amount of growth that must come from our perceptions of men and women and their assumed gender roles. So naturally, there is still a very stoic tone to the biological male, which unhealthily develops his socio-emotional state. And so the consequence of this is that 80%, or excuse me, the reality of this is that, oh my gosh, going forward with today's society, the two major components are identifying the distinctions and similarities of the evolving world and how we as a Jesuit culture can come together at Creighton University to make a difference in our own community. So, although the fields of psychology and sociology have progressed dramatically since the end of the Victorian era to present day, there is still lots of change that must come especially when we consider our current assumed gender roles. Naturally, there is still a very stoic tone to the biological male, which unhealthily develops his socio emotional state. So, the consequence of this is that men and boys in the US account for 78% of all suicides, 80% of fatal heroin overdoses, and 98% of mass shooters. Showing that as easy as it is to blame it on chemicals like testosterone in the body, uh, answers that simplistic cannot completely verify the nature of the issue. The emphasis on dominance, financial success, and happiness should be pressed deeper than any of Arthur's relationships, rather, in pushing further than just the surface. This same power struggle is clearly found within the women across the country as well. According to womensmarch.com, by January of this year, there had already been 250 rallies and protests for further equality among the sexes. And that's not to say anything about the rest of the world. That's simply what we are doing in the United States to try to bring us closer together as human beings. As members of the Jesuit community, it is our responsibility to find better solutions to the problem. Cura personalis, which many of you have probably heard by now, is care for the individual person. Pedro Arrupe once said that to be just, it is not enough to refrain from injustice. One must go further and refuse to play its game, substituting love for self-interest as the driving force of society. Whether it comes down to financial responsibility, social status, or how the world comes to perceive the culture that becomes history, focusing on our differences will never bring communities together the same way that love, empathy, and compassion will. So, thank you for your attention. We've talked about the three main points of the environment, of the current changing health misconceptions about the world, and how we can move past that. And we also talked a little bit about how little Dorrit exemplified a lot of the different things, somewhat abstract, but it did talk about, or show rather, how different things that were going on in the novel, it conceived the notion of lots of mental health problems that were going on within the Dorrit family, the Arthur Clennam, and a lot of the different relationships that were going on. It showed a lot of this different progression of dissatisfaction. And then we talked about how we as a community can come together to fix these problems. So regardless of our biological makeup, we are the footprint that will be left behind. The world will not care about what makes us distinct from one another. It will only care about how we came together to make it a better place. It is crucial to the survival of humankind that we learn how meaningless power and status are when understanding shows who we truly are. Thank you.